Counsel Severine Othick was reading the appearance roster aloud to her juniors when she reached the name that made the anteroom laugh, and she led it because the laugh was useful. Appearing for the Respondent Guild, she read, Advocate D. Mercer, Associate Role, sponsored by the Hollow Star Mutual Indemnity Pool. She lowered the slate. A human. The pool has sent the Salkin Guild a human. Pelik Avo, her newest junior, made the soft clicking sound Drathani made instead of whistling. An associate counsel, not even the full role. Can an associate appear before a board of inquiry? An associate can appear anywhere a full advocate consents to be embarrassed beside him, Severine said. The pool ensures at the cheapest rate in 4 systems. They have sent the cheapest answer to a 17-death inquiry. Noted in the file, Pelik. Note also that we will be civil about it. Civility costs nothing and reads well in the transcript. Through the anteroom's lattice wall, where the Respondent Guild had been given the small conference chamber with the broken climate vent, the regret was already audible. The Salkin Mutual Towage Guild had come up from the harbor that morning in their funeral greys. 11 Olvar, stocky and forearmed, hands scarred to the elbow from a combined 3 centuries of line work, and they had just met the advocate their insurers. Coin had bought them. We asked the pool for an advocate. That was Guildmother Akka Bren's voice, low and carrying, the voice of a being who had spent 60 years shouting over winches. We asked for an advocate, and they have sent us a clerk. Guildmother, a second voice, the guild secretary, miserable. Look at him. Look at what he carries. Paper, lum. He has brought paper to the spire. The combine will arrive with 40 sworn analysts and a wall of light, and our man has brought a pencil. A chair scraped. 17 of the harbor's children are dead. The combine says we killed them. The levy they ask would unmake this guild down to the last apprentice's last tooth. And the pool has sent us a gray little man who asks if we have kept our receipts. There was a pause, and then a human voice, flat and unhurried, the first time Severine ever heard it. Have you? Have we what? Kept your receipts. Severine caught Pelik's eye through the lattice and permitted herself the thin Drathani smile, the one that never reached the inner lids. Across the chamber, the guildmother said something in Harbor Olvar that the translation lattice declined to render, and the human said in the same flat tone, I'll take that as a yes. I'd like them brought to my room by tonight, all of them. Both moorings ledgers, the splice logs, the watch rosters, and the receipts. Going back 5 years. 5 years, the guildmother repeated. The tide that killed our birth row took one night, and he wants 5 years of paper. That's right, the human said. And as far as Severine could hear, he never explained himself at all. She filed the scene where she filed everything, neatly, with a tag for later use. Opposing client despises own counsel. It would be worth a paragraph in her closing address. Delicately handled, the poor Salkin Guild, abandoned by its insurer to inadequate representation, an institution more to be pitied than levied, though levied all the same. Sympathy was a lever. She had been pulling levers in the Spire's inquiry chambers for 30 years, and she had never once arrived with less than the heaviest case on the roster, because the Tesserin Combine did not retain advocates who lost the weight advantage. The Combine retained Severine Othick. The Charvain Spire stood at the head of the greatest tidal harbor on Vaughan, and from the high windows of its inquiry floor, you could see the whole wound the case was about. Birth Row 3, or what the paired tide had left of it. 2 moons had come over the bar together on the night of the disaster, the way they did once a generation, hauling the sea up the reach in a black wall with a storm riding its back. Somewhere in that night, the Combine's lift freighter Gilded Term, 90,000 tons of grain hull, moored in her sea cradle at the row's head, had come loose. She had gone down the row like a drop knife down a stair, and when the tide went out she lay across the bones of 3 berths, and 17 dockworkers of the harbor casks lay under her. The Combine's claim, filed before the funerals were done, was arithmetic. The Gilded Term had been sound, her tide irons had been inspected and stamped, therefore she had not loosed herself. Beside her had lain the Salkin Guild's tug Patient Ox, 70 years old, moored, said the Combine, on worn lines and harbor splices that no registry standard recognized. The lines had parted in the surge. The freed tug had battered the Gilded Term's cradle. The cradle's irons, abused beyond any inspector's imagining, had sheared. And 90,000 tons of consequence belonged, with compounding interest, to 11 Olvar and their funeral greys. The levy the Combine sought was $260 million in hull, cargo, berth reconstruction, and death price. The Guild's entire bond stood at $4 million. The arithmetic was not a case. It was an execution with exhibits. Severine had read the claim twice and the Combine's evidence schedule once, which was once more than she usually needed before a board of inquiry. The schedule was beautiful. Inspection certificates, stamped and countersigned, the harbor master's incident narrative, a tide table analysis from the Combine's own weather bureau, survey imagery of the parted tug lines, frayed ends pale as bone. It had arrived from the Combine's litigation office, complete, indexed and bound in the Directorate's own slate blue covers, and if any part of her had noticed that in 30 years no client had ever handed her a case with every single stone already polished and facing the light, that part had been told as always to be quiet and bill the hours. The board convened on a morning of low gray water. First Assessor Tyven Oluk presided, ancient and copper-eyed, flanked by Assessors Mott and Caraval. The gallery was full of harbor folk in mourning cords, combined clerks in slate blue, and the feed scribes who fed the port's news lattices. Severine entered with 6 juniors and the wall of light the guildmother had predicted. The Combine's exhibit array projected the full height of the chamber. Advocate Mercer entered alone, carrying a cardboard folio under one arm, and the gallery's laugh was soft but general. He was perhaps 60, as humans counted it, gray at the temples, in a suit the color of wet rope. He took the respondent's table, which the Combine's clerks had needed 3 trolleys to furnish on their own side, and laid out the folio, 2 pencils, and a paper ledger with a string down its spine. Then he sat still. Humans were rare enough on Vaughn that the gallery studied him like a tide. Curiosity and what the gallery saw, Severine knew, was what she had wanted them to see. The cheapest answer to a 17-death inquiry. Appearances, said First Assessor Oluk, Severine Othick, counsel of the Spire Bar, for the claimant Tessering Combine. Her voice carried the way she had trained it to carry, filling the chamber to its cornices. Dale Mercer, associate role, for the Salkin Mutual Towage Guild. Associate Assessor Mott said, leaning forward. You are aware, Advocate, that this board sits on a capital levy. The respondent is entitled to counsel of the full roll. If the guild wishes an adjournment to obtain, the guild can't afford the adjournment, Assessor Mercer said. It can afford me. And the board is to be satisfied that you are adequate to the weight of this matter. No, Mercer said. The board is to be satisfied by the record. I'd like to start building it. I have a request. Oluk's copper eyes half-lidded. State it. Access to the wreck of the gilded term and the remains of berth row 3, under the salvage warden's supervision. Access to the harbor's alarm and signal logs in their original form, not the claimant's summary, and the claimant's moorings maintenance ledgers for berth row 3. He paused and looked for the first time across at Severine. His eyes were a brown so ordinary she found them faintly insulting, going back 5 years. The claimant's evidence schedule is comprehensive, Severine said, rising. The respondent's request is a fishing expedition through 5 years of irrelevant paper, sought because the respondent's advocate has no case and hopes the harbor will write him one. The Combine objects to the burden. The Combine, Mercer said, owns the row my clients are accused of destroying. It seems fair they show the board how they kept it. Fairness is not burden, Advocate. No, he agreed mildly. It's usually heavier. A single low ripple crossed the gallery, not laughter exactly, but its cousin, and Severine noted with mild professional irritation that the human had not smiled, had not raised his voice, had not even looked at the gallery to collect what it gave him. He was watching the assessors and writing something in the paper ledger with a pencil, as though the exchange were already behind him and only its filing remained. First Assessor Oluk granted the rec access and the original logs, deferred the question of the 5-year ledgers, and set the deposition schedule. The witnesses of the paired tide to be examined one by one before the board, beginning with the harbor master in 6 days. It was the Spire's oldest procedure, older than the Combine itself. No juries, no speeches worth the name, just witnesses taken in order like soundings down a channel, the record deepening until the board could see bottom. Severine had always loved depositions the way a tide loves a narrow channel. They rewarded preparation, and no one on Vaughn prepared as her office prepared. 6 days, Pellick said, as they rode the Spire lift down through the cloud floor. What can he do in 6 days with a wreck and a pencil? Get wet, Severine said, and filed the human away. She would have been wiser. She told the board much later, in the only address of her career that ever cost her anything, to have ridden down to the harbor that same evening and watched him work. Because what Advocate Mercer did in his 6 days, while the Combine's office polished its certainties, was this. He put on a salvage warden's waders, and he went down to the black mud of berth row 3 at low tide with the wreck crews, and he stayed there. The salvage wardens told the story around the harbor before the week was out, because it amused them. The human had asked permission of the warden chief like an apprentice, not an advocate. He had asked the names of the 17 dead, written them on the first page of the paper ledger, and asked where each had been standing. He had walked the row's spine from the gilded term's berth to the tugs with a measuring cord, in the rain, 4 times. He had spent one whole tide doing nothing, as far as anyone could see, but looking at the stumps of the tide irons that had held the freighter's cradle, squatting in the mud, eye level with the sheared metal, while the water came up his boots. He had asked one of the wreck crews to saw him sample discs off 3 of the sheared irons, had watched the sawing the entire time, had wrapped each disc himself, written on each wrapping, and made the warden chief sign across every seal. Souvenirs, Pellick reported, gleeful, at the morning conference. He is collecting scrap metal, counsel. The wardens say he tips them in human coffee. What did he ask about the tug? Severine said. Pellick his slate. Nothing. He didn't board the tug at all. Severine's first heart did something small and unscheduled, a half-beat out of order, the organ's old habit when a fact arrived that did not fit the file. The respondent's whole case was the tug, the worn lines, the harbor splices, the 70-year hull. An advocate with no case fishes where his client's nets are. This one had walked past his client's boat 4 times to go and sit in the mud beside hers. She told the half-beat, as always, to be quiet and bill the hours. But she noted the fact where she noted everything, and the tag she gave it, though she did not say so to Pellick, was the first crack in a long wall. He is not preparing to defend the tug. He is preparing to inspect us. The harbor master of Charvain Reach was named Ulth Wren, and he had held the office for 40 years on the strength of a voice like a foghorn and a genius for owing everyone something slightly smaller than what they owed him. He arrived for his deposition in full ceremonial oils, was sworn on the tide tables in the old way, and gave evidence in chief exactly as the Combine's office had prepared it with him across 3 long and well-fed sessions, which is to say, beautifully. Severine led him through the night of the paired tide like a dance partner, the double moonrise, the storm warnings flown at dusk, the row's moorings doubled by his own general order, his watch office's view of the row, light strung berth to berth in the rain. And then the sequence the whole claim stood on, the sequence Wren delivered with his foghorn, dropped to a graveside hush. The sharp report of parting lines from the tug Patient Ox heard by his own ears across the water. Then the tug's mooring alarm on his board. Then, 4 minutes later, the cradle alarms of the gilded term as the loose tug fouled her. Then the long scream of metal that no one in the harbor would forget as 90,000 tons went down the row. The tug first, Severine said. You are certain of the order, harbor master. I have kept that watch since before the Combine raised the new terminal, Wren said. A parted line cracks like a whip the size of a street. Counsel. I heard the ox let go, and my board lit for the ox, and the rest followed. The order is the order. The little boat killed the row. He looked at the mourning cords in the gallery as he said it, sorrowful, magnificent. The feed scribes wrote like rain. Thank you, harbor master. Severine sat, satisfied to the soles of her gray feet, and First Assessor Oluk said the words that 30 years had taught her were the sound of a case half-banked. Your witness, Advocate Mercer. The human stood up slowly with his paper ledger, and the next 40 minutes became, in the Spire Bar's private language, in the years after, the morning the pencil came down the channel. Harbor master, Mercer said. You heard the tug's lines part. Where were you standing? My watch office. The watch office glazing the storm shutters were up that night? Naturally, it blew a full gale. So you heard a line part across 600 spans of open water, in a full gale, through a storm shutter. Mercer turned a page. What did the gale read at moonrise on your own anemometer log? Wren's oils gleamed. It was loud, Advocate, I won't deny. Your own log, harbor master. I have it here, the original, by the board's order. Shall I read the figure? A pause. Force 9, Wren said. Force 9. And the shutter's up. Mercer nodded slowly, as though being taught something. Help me then. You heard one crack, in a Force 9 gale, behind shutters, and you knew across 600 spans in the dark that it was the Patient Ox, and not any other sound in a harbor full of breaking weather. You knew it by ear. My board lit for the ox, Advocate, the alarm. We'll come to your board, Mercer said. I asked about your ears, but you'd rather we leave them. All right. He licked one finger unhurried and turned to a tabbed page, and Severine, watching, felt the half beat again harder because she had read the harbor master's evidence 11 times and she suddenly could not say what was on the human's tabbed page, and not knowing was not a thing that happened to her in this chamber. Your alarm board, Mercer said. The ordered the original signal logs. Not the incident summary your office filed with the Combine's claim, the raw log, every alarm, time-stamped by the harbor clock to the half-second. I've read it. He looked up. Have you? I wrote the summary from it. Then you'll remember the freighter's number 2 cradle strain alarm. The gilded term's own iron, her windward iron, crying overload. Mercer laid the page flat. 11 minutes before the tug's mooring alarm. Tell the board why it isn't in your summary. The chamber did not erupt. The Spire's inquiry floor never erupted. It was built of a stone that drank sound. What it did was lean. The whole gallery, the mourning cords and the slate blue clerks together, a degree and a half toward the witness chair, and Severine was on her feet before her second heart caught up with her first. Objection. A strain alarm is not a casualty alarm. Irons cry overload in every gale. The log will show dozens of strain alerts across the harbor that night. The advocate is dressing routine weather noise as a finding. The advocate, Mercer said, is asking why this particular noise was left out of a sworn summary. If it's routine, the harbor master can say so. It's his log. He may answer, First Assessor Oluk said. Wren's foghorn had developed in the space of a minute a smaller register. Strain alerts are commonplace in heavy weather, he said. The summary recorded casualty events. The term's number 2 alert cleared itself within. He checked nothing, looked at nothing, and Severine saw the assessors see it. Within a short period, it was not a casualty. It cleared itself, Mercer said, meaning the strain came off the iron. Yes, in a rising tide with the surge still building toward high water, on the windward iron of the heaviest hull in the row. Mercer turned to the next tab without hurry. I spent some time with your harbor's signal engineers this week, harbor master. Good people. They tell me there are 2 ways a strain alarm clears. The load comes off because the weather eases. He looked up. Or the load comes off because the iron has started to go, and the sensor at its head is no longer holding anything to measure. The weather record says the surge built for 2 more hours. So which was it? I cannot say what a sensor, you can't say. All right. Mercer made a small pencil mark, and Severine had begun to understand that the pencil marks were a procedure of their own, that the chamber had started watching for them the way a berth crew watches a load line. Last thing then. Your summary has the patient ox parting her lines at high water -40 on your board and in your ears, and the term's cradle alarms 4 minutes later. The raw log agrees with your board, but the log doesn't record whips and cracks. Harbor master, only your summary does that part. Your ears through the shutters in a force 9, so strike the ears. What your board actually knows is this: an 11-minute early overload on the freighter's windward iron that cleared itself, then the tug's moorings going, then the freighter's cradle going wholesale. I want to read you one sentence from your own office's standing watch manual. He found it with one finger. Where a heavy hull begins to walk her cradle, adjacent small craft will commonly part their moorings before the casualty becomes general, the row's load path being redistributed onto lines never rated to carry it. He closed the manual. Your manual, harbor master. Your predecessor wrote it. If the gilded term walked first, if she had already started dragging her row 11 minutes early, then the patient ox's lines parting wasn't the cause of anything. It was the alarm bell. The little boat didn't kill the row. The little boat was the first thing the row killed. That, Wren said, is a theory. It is, Mercer agreed. Yours is too. Mine matches the clock. No further questions this morning, but I'll ask the board to keep the witness available for recall. He gathered his ledger and sat down, flat-faced, and did not look at the gallery at all, and the gallery looked at nothing but him. First Assessor Oluk adjourned for the tide break, and Severine Othek walked back to her office through the spire's high cloister with 6 juniors behind her. In a silence she did not invite anyone to fill. It was not a defeat. She had repaired worse before second tide. Wren had been lazy and theatrical. The strain alarm needed an engineering answer, and the Combine's analysts would build her one by morning. That was the shape of an inquiry. Soundings, corrections, the channel walked again. What occupied her, what she resented occupying her, was a smaller thing. A clerk's thing. The human had found the 11 minutes in the raw log. Her office had the same log. It had arrived in the Combine's evidence consignment, slate blue covers, indexed. She had assigned its review to the analysts who had prepared the summary comparison, and the analyst's memorandum had pronounced the raw log consistent with the harbor master's account, and she had read the memorandum and not the log because reading memoranda instead of logs was what 30 years of seniority was for. He has no juniors, she thought, at the cloister's turn, where the wind came up the spire's face smelling of the mudflats, so he read it himself. The thought was supposed to be contempt. It refused, in some small way she declined to examine, to be only that. Counsel, Pellick said carefully at her shoulder. The directorate's liaison has called twice. Director Hack's Tesserine Oval asks whether the morning's turbulence requires any adjustment of strategy. Tell the director the channel's long and the first sounding favored the weather, Severine said. And Pellick, bring me the raw signal log. The log itself, not the memorandum. All of it, counsel, it runs to 900. All of it. She read until the spire's lamps came on, and the 11 minutes were exactly where the human had said they were, and they were not alone. There were 3 further strain events on berth row 3's irons in the 2 seasons before the paired tide. Small, cleared, routine, each on a heavy weather night, each on the row the Combine's claim described as inspected, stamped, and sound. Any analyst would call them weather noise. The analyst had. She marked the pages with slips of gray foil, told her hearts to keep civil time, and noticed a filed, tagged, resented, that she was doing tonight. After the wound, what the gray little man with the pencil had done before anyone was cut. The tide warden's deposition came 2 days later. And Severine took it seriously in a way the gallery could not have measured, because what the gallery saw was the Combine's counsel at her most courteous. The witness was Osu Lant, warden of tides for the Reach, a creature of the registry caste so old and so exact that assessors deferred to her tables the way they deferred to gravity. She was nobody's witness. That was the danger of her. Severine's questions built the storm tall, the paired tide as a once-a-generation event, the surge a hand and a half above the highest mark in the modern record. Conditions, counsel suggested gently, beyond what any reasonable harbor installation could be engineered to promise against. An act of the moons. If the night itself was unsurvivable, the order of failures mattered less. Everything in the row had simply died together of weather, and the levee would follow the paper, and the paper favored the Combine. Warden Lant agreed the night was the worst in the record. She agreed the surge exceeded the modern mark. Severine sat down with the storm standing nicely over the whole case like a wall. Mercer stood up with his ledger and dismantled the wall in 11 questions, and the wall, Severine had to concede, came down politely, because he had built the demolition entirely out of the witness's own life's work. Warden, your office sets the harbor's engineering tide. The figure every installation in the Reach must be built and maintained to survive. What is it? Crown surge of the paired tide cycle, plus a margin of 1/5, Lance said. It is the oldest standard in the registry. The Reach has kept it for 900 years, precisely because the paired tide always returns. So the worst night in the modern record, was it beyond the figure your office requires the harbor to survive? No, the warden said. It was within it. The paired tide is not an act of the moon's advocate. It is a scheduled appointment. My office published its date 11 years in advance. And the mooring standard for a hull like the gilded term, her tide irons, her cradle, to what figure must those be maintained? Engineering tide plus the heavy hull margin. A properly kept iron on that row should have carried that night's load, Warden Lance said, with a third of its strength to spare. If one didn't, Mercer said, what does that tell the registry? Objection, Severine said, rising, hearing in her own voice, and hating it, the smallest new note of routine. Calls for speculation on metallurgy outside the witness's office. Rephrase, Oluk said gladly. Warden, in 900 years of your office's records, how many properly maintained heavy hull irons has the Reach lost to any tide within the engineering figure? Asulant consulted nothing. Her answer entered the record in the tone of a tide table. None. Mercer made his pencil mark. No further questions. That evening, the Combine's liaison did not call twice. Director Hack's Tesserin Oval came himself, robed in directorate slate, and sat in Severine's office uninvited, in the chair her clients had been sitting in for 30 years, and reminded her at length and with charm of how much the Combine's retainer underwrote, her chambers, her juniors, the Othek name on the spire bar's high boards. Then he set a new bound folder on her desk, slate blue covers indexed. The engineering response on the strain alarms, he said. Our analysts have been thorough. Sensor ghosting in heavy weather, documented, referenced, very tidy. The 11 minutes will be noise by week's end. I'll read it, Severine said. You'll deploy it. I'll read it first. She heard the sentence land somewhere outside her usual orbit. So did he. The director's inner lids came down slowly. The Drathani equivalent of a raised eyebrow held 1 second too long. The human is an associate clerk in a rope-colored suit, he said, rising. The directorate did not retain the Spire's finest counsel to be tutored by him in reading. When he was gone, she sat with the slate blue folder a long while without opening it, listening to her hearts disagree, and across the cloud floor, down at the harbor's edge, the lamp in the small hired room above the chandlers, the room the whole bar now knew was the human's, burned exactly, as it had burned every night since the board first sat, low, steady, and surrounded by paper. She opened the slate blue folder at midnight, alone, and read it as a hostile document, which was a thing she had not done to her own sides paper since she was a copying pool girl in the registry with ink to her second knuckle. The analysis was good. That was the trouble with it. Sensor ghosting in saturated weather was real. The references were real. The conclusion arrived exactly where the directorate needed it to arrive, by a road with no weeds on it. 30 years of reading the other side's briefs had taught her what an honest analysis looked like, and an honest analysis limped somewhere, conceded something, left one stone unfaced. This one was polished on every side like the evidence consignment itself, like the inspection certificates, like the harbor master's 3 well-fed preparation sessions, and at some hour past the second tide, Severine Othek admitted into the front of her mind the thought she had been keeping in the servants' corridor, at the back of it. Her case had not been prepared. It had been manufactured. She did not act on the thought. She wants it recorded. It is recorded, in the transcript of a much later proceeding, that for 11 more days she did not act on it, because the thought was not yet a fact, and because the retainer was the chamber's whole foundation, and because she was Severine Othick of the Spire Bar and the alternative was unthinkable. Until day by day and witness by witness, a man in a rope-colored suit made it thinkable. The harbor, meanwhile, had begun to change its mind about the human in the way harbors do from the bottom up. Pellick brought the reports to morning conference because intelligence on opposing counsel was his assignment, and the reports kept failing to contain what they were supposed to contain. The human did not go to the advocate's dining floor. He ate at the chandlery counter with the salvage crews, where he was teaching the counterkeeper to make human coffee and drinking the local silt tea without complaint while he did it. He had been seen at the registry's public room reading mooring standards in the queue like anyone. He had hired nobody and summoned nobody. When the Dock families came to his little room above the Chandlers, and they had begun to come, shy, in twos, he wrote their accounts in the paper ledger by hand and read each one back until the witness agreed it was right, and he had addressed the lowest grade of harbor cast by name and honorific, which the gallery's feed scribes had started to notice because no one else in the Spire's history ever had. He is canvassing sympathy, Pellick said. He's never once looked at the gallery, Severine said. Sympathy is collected by looking. What he is doing, Pellick, is called taking statements. It is what advocates did before they had offices to do it for them. She heard her own sentence too late to stop it. It had a door in it, and through the door was the copying pool, and the girl with ink to her knuckle, who had once believed that the whole of the law was reading everything and writing down what was true. The feed scribes call him the mud advocate, Pellick offered. Yes, she said. So will the board's findings, one way or the other. Get out. The third deposition was the Combine's own moorings inspector, and his name was Cathal Meir, and Severine had prepared him personally for 2 sessions and found him exactly what his certificates declared. Precise, complacent, stamped, and countersigned. His evidence-in-chief ran 1 hour. Berth Row 3's tide irons inspected each season under his own glass. The gilded terms cradle, surveyed and certified 11 weeks before the paired tide. Every iron sound, every stamp true. Severine led him through it, and the certificates glowed on the wall of light, and she sat down knowing the morning was clean and knowing equally, in the new servant's corridor of her mind, that she no longer believed a word of her own exhibit wall, and that no one had made her say so yet. Mercer stood and was for a moment almost companionable. Inspector, 11 weeks before the disaster, you surveyed the gilded terms cradle irons personally. Personally under glass as the certificate records. That would be the survey of the 4th of low month. Mercer turned to Page. Where do you take the harbor ferry on low month mornings, Inspector? The silence had a texture Severine knew. It was the sound a witness makes discovering that somewhere, sometime, without knowing which fact would matter, he has been counted. I attend the southern repair yards in low month, some mornings. The ferry manifests are public registry documents, so I read them, Mercer said, as though confessing a mild private vice. You signed aboard the southern ferry at first tide on the 4th of low month and signed off the return at dusk. The southern yards are 4 hours down channel. The certificate puts you under glass at Berth Row 3 at midday. He looked up. Which document is lying, Inspector? They can't both hold. Objection. Severine rose because the retainer rose her. The words she had prepared for moments like this her whole career came out and tasted. For the first time, like the silt tea everyone at the chandlery counter pretended was drinkable. The certificate is a fair copy reissue. Clerical dating errors in fair copies are commonplace and prove nothing about the underlying survey. Counsel makes my application for me, Mercer said. If the certificate is a fair copy, somewhere there's an original. The respondent applies for the originals, the inspector's field books, this row 5 years. He turned to her, mild as milk. The claimant's office will know where they're kept. First, Assessor Oleg's copper eyes rested on Severine for a moment she felt in both hearts. The board has been patient with the question of the claimant's ledgers, Oleg said. Its patience now has a date. Originals, field books, maintenance ledgers, the row's requisition records, to be produced to the board within 6 days. The claimant will comply. The board rose. Inspector Meir left the chair like a being walking on a deck no longer entirely under him, and in the gallery the morning cord sat unmoving, watching the wall of light where the certificates still glowed, stamped and countersigned, and Severine watched them watch, and understood with a clarity that arrived like cold water exactly what she had been retained to do to those families, and that she had been doing it well. The guildmother came to the humans' room above the Chandlers that evening. Severine knew because surveillance of opposing counsel's visitors was also Pellick's assignment, and Pellick's report of it, transcribed from a listener in the chandlery loft, was 4 lines long, and Severine read the 4 lines more times than she ever admitted to anyone. You should be angry at us, Otka Bren had said. We called you a clerk in your hearing. We have not once said your name with respect in our own hall, and you have been in the mud for our dead from the first tide. You should be angry." And the human had said, "You'd lost 17 people, and they sent you a stranger with a pencil. You judged the pencil. So did I, 30 years ago. The pencil is what was left after everything quicker let me down. Sit, Guildmother, we have receipts to read." That was all the listener got, because that, apparently, was all there was. The levy of the century on the table, and the man had gone back to receipts. Severine set the report down on her desk beside the slate-blue folder she had never deployed, and the gray foil markers in the signal log, and the field book order with its 6-day fuse, and she sat in her chamber's perfect quiet while her hearts beat out of phase and named the feeling. She had been declining to name since the morning the pencil came down the channel. It was not professional alarm. Her position was still strong. The storm defense had survived. The inspector's collapse could be quarantined to one lazy official. Juries did not exist, and assessors did not sentimentalize. The feeling was older and smaller, and much worse, it was recognition. The gray little man reading everything because no one would read it for him. The names of the dead on the first page of the ledger. The flat refusal to perform for the gallery, to gloat, to be anything but accurate. She had been that creature once, in the copying pool, before the Combine's retainer taught her that polish was a substitute for weight. She had spent 6 weeks inviting a chamber to laugh at the self she had abandoned, and the chamber had laughed, and the self had gone on quietly winning the record, witness by witness, in a rope-colored suit. The Directorate's response to the 6-day order was a masterpiece of the form, and Severine, who had drafted 100 such masterpieces herself, watched this one assemble from inside with the particular nausea of an architect touring a collapsing building she had taught everyone to build. The field books arrived at the board, 3 of the 5 years water-stained into illegibility by an unfortunate flood in the records annex, attested by a notarized account of the flood. The maintenance ledgers arrived complete, immaculate, and freshly bound. The requisition records arrived with 1 folio of the Directorate's minute book, folio 88. The index said Berth Row 3, Ironwork Appropriations, certified as lost to the same flood. There was no flood, she said to Director Hax Tesserinoval, in his tower office above the cloud floor, with the whole reach laid out below them like an exhibit. She had not been summoned, she had come. That fact alone, she supposed, was already a kind of resignation letter, written in a language neither of them would admit to reading yet. "There is a notarized account of a flood," the director said. "I have been deploying your paper for 6 weeks, Director. I know what your paper is worth. I am telling you, as your counsel, that the human has read every public registry on this harbor, that he found a ferry manifest to break an inspector, and that if 1 ink order, 1 foundry invoice, 1 apprentice's pay chit anywhere in this port touches what was in folio 88, he has already found it and he is waiting for your flood. Because the flood is how he proves you knew. Do not give him the flood. Give me the folio. If the Combine deferred the Rose ironwork, tell me now in this room and I will do what counsel exists to do. I will mitigate, I will negotiate, I will carry what can lawfully be carried." The director looked at her for a long moment with his inner lids down, and then he said the sentence that ended 30 years. "Counsel will deploy the notarized account, conduct the defense as instructed, and leave the Directorate's appropriations to the Directorate. Or counsel will discover what else in this spire the Combine's retainer underwrites, and how quickly." It is in the nature of towers, Severine thought, going down in the long lift through the cloud floor, that everything in them is above something. She had built her chambers in the tower's shadow and called the shadow eminence. Down at the harbor's edge, in the rain, the lamp over the chandlery was lit, and for the first time in 30 years she understood it as the thing it had been all along, not opposing. Counsel's lamp, but the only light in the case that was actually on. The 4th deposition was the wreck surveyor, and it was the morning the case stopped being about a tug. The surveyor was a being called Doss Kettle, of the crustacean engineering casts of the southern yards, broad as a winch housing. With a survey warrant 40 years old and no allegiance the Combine had ever managed to purchase, though Severine's office files recorded that it had twice tried, he had been retained by the board itself in the spire's oldest tradition, the assessor's own eyes on the wreck. He brought to the chamber a case of specimen mounts, and at the respondent table the human laid out, beside the paper ledger, 3 small wrapped discs that the gallery had been hearing rumors about for weeks. Severine had spent 2 days preparing her cross-examination of Doss Kettle, and she had done it with a divided mind because her instructed position, censor ghosting, storm beyond reckoning, the tug's worn lines as first cause now resembled, in her private inventory, a ship's figurehead, carved, painted, and attached to nothing that steered. Mercer's examination of the surveyor ran 2 hours, and Severine, who had watched every examiner of her generation work, made her juniors attend and take a verbatim, because what the chamber was watching, though the gallery had no word for it, was an advocate disappearing entirely into his witness. He performed nothing. He asked the kind of short, dull, load-bearing questions a foreman asks at a shift change, and the surveyor's answers came out of them like cargo coming out of a hold, one piece at a time, in working order. The sheared tied irons of the gilded term's cradle, said Doss Kettle, told their own history and their grain. A sound iron failing in one terrible night breaks bright, a clean crystalline face, sharp-edged, the metal's last honest protest. The faces of the number 2 and number 4 irons were not bright. They were stained dark across 2/3 of their section, old growth. The surveyor said fatigue creep spreading season by season, oxidized in layers like tide marks in a cave, with only the last thin crescent of each face showing the bright break of the final night. How long, Mercer asked, to grow stains like that? 2 seasons at the least, more likely 3. Could a seasonal inspection under glass have missed it? Under glass? The surveyor's mouth parts worked once, the crustacean equivalent of a grim laugh. Advocate, the creep on number 2 had opened a surface seam as long as my claw. An inspector under glass could not have missed it. An inspector walking past at a brisk pace in fog could not have missed it. The claimant's certificates record both irons as sound 11 weeks before the disaster. Then the certificates, said Doss Kettle, in the tone of a being closing a hatch, describe some other harbor. Mercer let that sit for exactly as long as it needed and not one breath longer. And then he did the thing that Severine knew, watching she would be teaching juniors about for the rest of her life under whatever name her life was about to have. He picked up his 3 wrapped discs and had the surveyor unwrap them in the chair. Seals photographed. The warden chief's signature across each wrapping read aloud into the record. The chain of custody walked link by link from the black mud of berth row 3 to the witness's claw, and the discs were sections of the same 2 irons, sawn under the human's own eyes in the first 6 days, before the combine salvage contractors had begun their site clearance. Before, as Mercer put it without adjectives, the row's remaining ironwork had been cut up and smelted as scrap by the claimant, on the claimant's instruction, in the claimant's own southern yards, 4 weeks into a live inquiry. The respondent tenders the discs as exhibits, Mercer said. They're the only pieces of berth row 3's irons left on Vaughn. I thought somebody other than me had better hold them. First, Assessor Oluk looked at the discs for a long moment, and then at Severine, and the look was a question the size of the chamber. Did counsel for the claimant know her client had smelted the evidence? And the truthful answer, which she gave with her face, because her face was all she could lawfully volunteer, was no. The site clearance order had never crossed her desk. Her client had not consulted its own counsel before destroying the subject matter of the inquiry, which meant her client had a lawyer somewhere it trusted more than her, or trusted no lawyer at all, and was simply burning its way to the verdict it had purchased the paper for. Her cross-examination of Doss Kettle lasted 11 minutes and was, the Spire Bar's Journal later wrote, technically immaculate and morally transparent. Counsel establishing, with the precision of a surgeon who no longer believes in the operation, that the surveyor could not date the creep's origin to a specific season, that load history, not neglect alone, shapes fatigue, that the discs represented 2 irons of a cradle of 8. Every point stood. None of it touched the stains on the metal, and she knew it, and the assessors knew it. And somewhere behind her in the gallery sat 17 families who had been told for 6 weeks that a 70-year-old tug had killed their children, and Severine Othick heard her own beautiful trained voice working and understood that the voice had become the most expensive thing the Combine owned. The Combine answered the surveyor inside the week with its own expert, because Towers always answered weight with weight, and Severine, under instruction, called him. A signal systems doctor from the Combine's Central Bureau, robed in academic gray, trailing 4 degrees in a citation list as long as the tide tables, the author, literally. The directorate had circulated the fact like a menu of the sector's standard text on strain telemetry. His evidence-in-chief was the slate blue folder made flesh, sensor ghosting in saturated weather reference cascades, the gilded term's 11-minute alarm reclassified, with charts and great courtesy, as instrumental noise. The wall of light bloomed with waveforms. The gallery's feed scribes, drowning agreeably in mathematics, wrote that the claimant had restored equilibrium, and Severine conducted the whole examination from her own instructed script and felt, the entire morning, like a being polishing a figurehead while the hull went on quietly taking water beneath her. Mercer's cross-examination of the sector's leading authority on strain telemetry lasted 9 minutes, and the Spyarbers juniors study it to this day, because it contained no telemetry at all. Doctor, your model says the alarm was ghosting, false load, born in a wet sensor. The log shows the alarm cleared itself 11 minutes later. What clears a ghost alarm on your model? The saturation episode passes, the sensor recovers its baseline. The rain stopped, in other words. In simplified terms, the conditions moderated, yes. The Warden of Tides has sworn the surge and the rain built without pause for 2 further hours. Mer turned 1 page. So your ghost was born in saturating and died while the saturation got worse. Does your textbook describe a ghost that does that? A pause. Of a length the chamber had learned to price. Edge cases exist. Page 211 of your own text, Doctor, 3rd edition. The only edition the Combines Bureau didn't fund, I'll read it. A saturation artifact persists or worsens while conditions persist or worsen. An alarm that clears against the weather gradient must be treated as mechanical, not instrumental, until the head is physically examined. He laid the book down. Was the number 2 iron sensor head ever physically examined? It was not recovered. It was smelted, Doctor, with the rest of the rose ironwork, by the client who hired you to call it a ghost. You wrote the sentence that says you can't. I have nothing else. He sat, and the pencil made its small mark, and the sector's standard text on strain telemetry remained on the exhibit table where he had laid it, face up. Like a witness, the Combine had somehow managed to call against itself. That evening, Pellick came to her chambers without an appointment, carrying his slate against his chest, the way a much younger creature carries a thing he is afraid of being seen with. Counsel. The verbatim you ordered of today's examination. I made a copy for myself. His inner lids flickered. I have been reading the originals at night. The signal log, the ferry manifest, the field books, the 2 legible years. I started after the harbor master because I wanted to find what the human found before he found it, just once, to show you I could. He set the slate down. Counsel. I went looking in the foundry registries, public documents like the ferry lists. The southern yards cast replacement tide irons to order. Every casting has a poor record. The poor records cite the requisition that pays for them. 3 years ago, a requisition was drafted for the recasting of Berth Row 3's full cradle set. Drafted, numbered, cited in the foundry's advanced schedule. Then it disappears. No pour, no cancellation minute in anything we've been given. The foundry's schedule note says only, deferred by instrument of the directorate. The instrument's citation is to the minute book. He stopped and made himself say it. The chamber was very quiet. Out the high window, far down, the chandlery lamp was on. You understand what you are holding, Severine said. I think so, Counsel. You are holding proof that our client knew its row was condemned, decided not to pay for it, wrote the decision down, and has now drowned the page in an invented flood. She heard the words go out steady, each one a plank pulled off a ship she was standing on. And you are holding it as a junior of the chambers retained to argue that page out of existence. Pellick stood very straight. What do we do with it? And the answer that came out of her was not from the 30 years. It was older stock, copying pool stock, ink to the knuckle stock, and it surprised her like a hand from underwater. We check it, she said, twice tonight, the way he would. They checked it twice, and it held both times, and at some hour past second tide, surrounded by foundry schedules and pay chits, and 1 ink-stained pencil Pellick had bought at the chandlery out of some sentiment he refused to explain. Severine Othick sat back and looked at the whole architecture of her case from the outside, the way the board would eventually see it, the way the human had perhaps seen it from the first week. The manufactured consignment, the rehearsed harbor master, the impossible certificates, the smelted irons, the flooded folio, every component pointing one direction with the dumb honesty of iron filings. And at the magnet's center, a decision someone in a tower had made 3 years ago that 17 funerals were cheaper than a cradle set. The mockery was the part she could no longer stand to look at. Not his, he had never once returned it. Hers. We have sent the cheapest answer to a 17-death inquiry. She had said it to her juniors on the first morning, and the chamber had laughed, and every day since, the cheapest answer had gone down into the mud where her client's victims had died, and her client's money had never gone, and read what no one paid him enough to read, and carried the dead's names on the first page of his ledger, while the most expensive advocate on Vaughan stood in front of the wall of light, arranging the filings into prettier shapes. She had mocked him for the pencil. The pencil was the only instrument in the entire inquiry that had never written a false word. The 5th deposition belonged to the Dock families, and the Combine in its tower finally made the mistake Severine had stopped being able to prevent and had not yet found the courage to refuse. It tried to manage the witnesses. They were 4, a winch leader, 2 line hands, and the widow Imtala, whose husband had been the row walker of Berth Row 3, the man whose post was the row's spine itself, walking the irons in all weathers, and who had died on it. All 4 were of the harbor's lowest registry caste, the merfolk, beings the spire's protocols had no honorific for at all, which had never once been a problem for anyone in the chamber's 900-year history, because no mer had ever been sworn in it. The board swore them on the tide tables like anyone, Oluk seeing to it personally, and the gallery saw that whole long morning two things side by side that no closing address would ever have put so plainly. They saw the Combine's junior counsel, not Pellick. The directorate had inserted its own man for this witness list, over Severine's signature and nearly over her body, address all four witnesses in the flat grammatical register reserved for cargo manifests, mispronounce the widow's name 3 times after correction, and ask her, in the inquiry's single most expensive question, whether her husband's reports of screaming iron had perhaps been the fancy of a caste known for superstition. And they saw the human stand up for his examination and say, Madam Roe Walker's widow Hala, I'm told that's the correct form of your house's honorific. If I have it wrong, please correct me. You've been corrected enough for one morning. You have it right, advocate. The widow first. What she then gave the record, in the mer's slow ceremonial cadence, with her 4 hands folded, was the inquiry's heart, and everyone in the chamber knew it as it was happening. Her husband had reported the windward irons of the Gilded Term's cradle singing wrong for 2 seasons, had logged it, in the Roe Walker's pocketbook, in his own hand, 11 separate times, had reported it up the Wharfinger's chain, where the reports went into the Combine's maintenance system and came back stamped assessed, no action, had told his wife, on the night before the paired tide, that he would walk the row to the freighter's berth first when the surge came, because, he said, if the big one's irons let go, somebody has to be there to sound the row clear and get the berth crews off the spine. The alarm that night, Mercer said gently. The row clear, did it sound? It sounded. Advocate. 4 berths got their crews off because it sounded. Who sounded it? My husband, said the widow Imthala, from the windward stand, where they found him. In the gallery the morning chords did not cry out, because the mer do not, but a sound went through them like wind through standing rigging, and Severine Othick looked at the row of slate-blue clerks across the chamber and saw 2 of them weeping, and looked down at her own hands on her own immaculate brief, and did not stand up when the examination ended to cross-examine the widow at all. No questions for this witness, she said, and heard, in the transcript of her own voice, the sound of a wall coming down politely. The pocketbook had never been found, the widow said. Her husband's effects had come back from the Combine's casualty office complete except for it. That fact entered the record quietly, almost as housekeeping, and Severine watched the human make one small pencil mark beside it, and understood that the missing pocketbook and the flooded folio 88 were now standing next to each other in the board's mind. 2 empty spaces with the same shape, and that he had built the entire morning so they would. The Combine's next move arrived not in the chamber, but at the harbor, which was how Severine knew the tower had begun to be afraid. 3 days after the widow's testimony, the Directorate's commercial office, not its litigation office, the towers kept their hands sorted, presented the Salkin Mutual Towage Guild with an offer of compromise. The Combine, mindful of the harbor's grief and the uncertainty of proceedings, would reduce its levy from $260 million to $4 million, precisely, to the last coin, the Guild's bond. The Guild would be spared. The Guild would also be emptied, dissolved as a mutual, its members reduced to wage hands on Combine books. And the inquiry would be discontinued by consent before the board made any findings at all. No findings. That was the entire price and the entire point. 17 sets of findings traded for the contents of one small strongbox. The Guildhall met by lamplight to consider it, and the listener in the chandlery loft earned his fee one last time because the human was asked for his advice and gave it standing. And Pellick's transcript of what he said ran longer than 4 lines for the first and only time. I'm your advocate, so here is the advocacy. If you take this, you are safe, and my opinion of the offer has no standing against your apprentice's suppers. Take it, and I'll draw the instrument myself and get you terms on the wage scales. A pause in the transcript marked inaudible movement. And here is the rest, because you paid for all of me. They are not buying your guild. Your guild isn't worth $4 million to them. They are buying the board's silence with your name on the receipt. Every family on that row will be told the inquiry ended because the Salkin Guild consented, that you took the price and folded the question of who killed their children into your own funeral. The Combine has smelted the irons, flooded the folio, and lost the pocketbook. You are the last piece of evidence it can still buy. That's the whole of it. I'll draw whichever instrument you choose. The transcript recorded the guild mother asking one question into the lamplight: can we carry the levy if we refuse and lose? And the human, no. And Otka Bren, guild mother of the Salkin Mutual Towage Guild, in the 7th decade of her line service on that water. Then we'd better not lose. Send the tower its answer, advocate. The guild declines. Spell declines the long way, the old harbor spelling, so they have to take it to a registry clerk to be sure. Severine read that transcript at her desk with one hand pressed flat against it, and the feeling that went through both her hearts at the old spelling of declines was not, she observed with some clinical interest, professional dismay at a settlement refused. It was pride. It was entirely misplaced, proprietorially absurd, and pride. The case had stopped being hers weeks ago. Some of her, reading by lamplight what the cheapest answer in 4 systems had said to his clients with, "The listener in the rafters." Counsel who would say the same thing whether or not anyone was listening, which was, she understood now, the entire definition she had spent 30 years failing to be. Some of her had simply changed sides and was waiting, with a patience she did not feel, for the rest of her to file the appearance. The morning after the refusal, Advocate Mercer rose before the board on what the schedule called a procedural application and detonated, in his flattest voice, the inquiry's first true charge. The respondent applies for production of folio 88 of the claimant directorate's minute book, cited in the claimant's own requisition index as Birth Row 3, Ironwork Appropriations. The claimant certifies the folio destroyed by flood. The respondent tenders the following, with originals for the board. The pencil tapped the folio once, the only theater he ever permitted himself. Item: the Foundry Advance Schedule of the Southern Yards for the year before last, a public registry document, carrying a drafted requisition for the recasting of Birth Row 3's full cradle set, citation to folio 88. Item: the Foundry's pour records for the following 3 seasons, showing no pour for Birth Row 3 was ever made. Item: the schedule's closing annotation, deferred by instrument of the Directorate. Item: the claimant's casualty office inventory of the Row Walker Halla's effects, signed at intake, listing, line 9, 1 pocketbook, leather, marked with the Row's number, and the release inventory signed by the widow, 11 days later, listing no such book. The board will note that the claimant's flood was remarkably selective. It destroyed 1 folio out of a minute book of 400, and the folio it chose was the one the Foundry had already quoted. The notarized account of the record's annex flood, began the Directorate's, inserted Junior Rising, because this witness list in this application, too, had been taken out of Severine's hands, the Tower trusting its own counsel less by the day. Is notarized, Mercer agreed. So was Inspector Mears' certificate. The respondent has stopped reading the claimant's notary stamps and started reading its plumbing. The annex flood is recorded by the Spire's own works office as a burst feed line, half a span of water, in the annex's western bay. The minute books are shelved in the eastern bay. The works office measured. I asked them to. He looked up at the assessors, and for the first time since the inquiry opened, Dale Mercer raised his voice, not far, perhaps a quarter turn of a winch. The chamber heard it the way a crew hears a load shift. 17 people are dead, and the paper that says why keeps drowning and going missing 1 page at a time, and every page that drowns belongs to the claimant, and every page that survives convicts it. The respondent applies for the folio, for the registrar's duplicate minute that the Directorate's own procedures require to exist, and for the board's patience to be recorded as exhausted. The application is granted in every part, said First Assessor to Van Oluk, and her copper eyes did not go to the inserted Junior at all. They went to Severine and rested there, and the old assessor said in the voice the Spire kept for its oldest procedures. The board reminds senior counsel for the claimant that she is an officer of this board before she is anyone's retained instrument. The board does not yet ask counsel any question. The board observes only that a time approaches when it must. Severine rose and bowed and said, "Counsel is aware of the time, First Assessor," and sat down, and the transcript records nothing else, because the transcript could not record what the sentence cost or how long its speaker had been drafting it. The Tower summoned her at dusk. She went up through the cloud floor for what she knew would be the last time, and found Director Hack's Tesserin Oval standing at his window with the reach spread out below him, and on his desk, lying between them like a verdict, a single old folio in Directorate slate, its corner stamped 88. It was never flooded, she said. Floods are administrative instruments, the director said. Sit, counsel. You wanted the folio. There it is. Read it. She read it standing. It was 4 pages, and it was worse than the Foundry's shadow had promised. The deferral was there. The cradle set's recasting postponed 2 years running, the funds redirected to the new terminal ceremonial gate, the engineering caution noted and overruled in a single line, residual risk accepted on commercial grounds. But beneath the minute, in the folio's correspondence sleeve, lay the thing the shadow had never shown. The Wharfinger's consolidated report of the Row Walker's 11 warnings, forwarded to the Directorate with the maintenance office's covering memorandum, 8 months before the paired tide. The Tower had not merely deferred the iron. It had been told in a dead man's own logged words that the iron was singing wrong, and it had stamped the dead man assessed, no action, and filed him in a sleeve. You will appreciate the position, the director said to the window. The folio cannot enter the record. The duplicate minute will be found to have been misshelved. Registrars misshelve. The search the board has ordered will be conducted with great diligence and will fail. What is required from counsel is craftsmanship. The applications resisted on clean grounds, the inferences contained, the findings steered to weather and to the tug's contributory state. There is no direct proof without the folio. There is only shape. You have spent 30 years teaching this spire that shape is arguable. Argue it. And the alternative, Severine said, since you have shown me the folio itself, is that I am now a witness. The alternative, the director said, turning, is that you are now expensive in a different way. The retainer ends. The chamber's floor reverts to the combine's lease. The bar's high boards remember their patron. And the spire learns, gently, through channels that counsel Othic's grasp began to slip in her 30th year as grasps do. No one will mock you, counsel. The combine does not mock, it curates. He set one gray hand flat on the folio. The human reads everything, we are told, let him. There will be nothing left to read but weather. She walked down to the harbor that night, alone on her own feet, through the freight lanes where she had not walked since the copying pool, and stood across the wet cobbles from the chandlery in its one lit window, and did not cross. There were rules older than the retainer about approaching opposing counsel mid-inquiry, and she had broken nothing yet, and she discovered, standing in the rain with both hearts arrhythmic, that she wanted to enter that small room less to confess than simply to sit, 1 hour, in the company of the only practice of law left in Charvain reach that would not require her to be ashamed. Up in the window, the shape of the human passed and repassed, a gray man pacing with a page in his hand, reading as he walked, the pencil tucked above one ear like a dockhand's roll marker. He read everything. He would read the weather defense she was ordered to build, and he would take it apart in his flat voice clause by clause, and he would never once look at her with contempt, because he never looked at anyone with contempt, and that, she stood in the rain and let the fact arrive all the way. That was the unbearable part. The mockery she had spent on him on the first morning had nowhere to land but on herself, and it had been landing there, quietly, accurately, every day for 2 months, delivered in her own remembered voice. We will be civil about it. Civility costs nothing. She went back up to her chambers, took down the small flat case she had carried from the registry 30 years ago, and opened it for the first time in a decade. Inside, on harbor paper gone soft as cloth, in the careful hand of a copying pool girl, was her enrollment oath to the spire bar. She read it standing, the way she had read the folio. It ran 11 lines, it mentioned no client, it mentioned the record 4 times. The tower's last clean weapon was aimed not at the evidence but at the man, and Severine learned of it the way she now learned of all her client's decisions. When the application appeared on the board's morning list over the inserted junior's name, application by the claimant to terminate the appearance of D. Mercer associate role on grounds of want of qualification. It was, as drafting, the best thing the Directorate's litigation office ever produced for that inquiry, and Severine read it with the connoisseurship of the condemned. The associate role, it argued, existed for harbor small claims and registry matters. An inquiry of capital weight demanded counsel of proven standing. The respondent's advocate held no degree of any recognized law college in the sector, had never been called to a full bar on any world, and had spent, the application produced the human's own service record like a soiled glove. 31 years as a claims investigator for a freight insurance pool, a trade, said the application, of adjusters and ledger clerks. The guild deserved better. The dead deserved better. The board's dignity demanded better. It was signed, sealed, and perfectly aimed at everything the spire had spent 900 years believing about pedigree, and it asked the assessors, in language of great courtesy, to do in their own chamber what Severine had done in the anteroom on the first morning. Look at the rope-colored suit and rule that a clerk is a clerk. The board heard it at second, sitting before a gallery so full the wardens closed the doors. The inserted junior performed it beautifully. And then First Assessor Olek asked the human whether he wished to be heard on his own qualification, and the chamber leaned, and Dale Mercer stood up with his paper ledger and was heard. Everything in the application is true, he said. No college, no call. 31 years of freight claims. I'd add one item the claimant's researchers missed. I failed the soul bar examination, twice. The second time by 1 mark, which my wife always said, was the examiner's being kind the first time. A low sound crossed the gallery, half a laugh, gone at once. He hadn't paused for it. Here's what freight claims is, since the application asks. Somebody's cargo arrives crushed or burned or doesn't arrive, and everybody in the chain swears it was sound when it left them, and they all have certificates, and the certificates all have stamps, and somewhere under all that paper is a fact. A box either was lashed to standard or it wasn't. An iron either was recast or it wasn't. For 31 years, my trade was finding the fact under the stamps in dock offices and foundry yards and harbor masters' lofts on 40 worlds, with no power to summon anybody and no gown to frighten them with. Just the documents everyone forgot were public and the arithmetic nobody bothered to do. The claimant calls that a clerk's trade. I won't argue. I'll only say this inquiry is now sat for 9 weeks, and the board can ask itself which it has had more use for so far, my qualifications or my arithmetic. He squared the ledger on the table, that being the whole of his peroration. The guild hired what its insurer could afford. The dead get what the record can prove. I'm content to be measured by the second thing, because it's the only one of the two I ever had any say in. He sat down. He had not raised his voice the quarter turn this time. The chamber was so quiet Severine could hear the tide bell out on the reach, and she sat looking at the gray little man who had just laid his 2 failures in front of 900 years of pedigree like exhibit discs, chain of custody intact, and she thought with the suddenness of a line parting, he has more standing in his failures than I have left in my whole enrolled name. She did not know she was going to rise until she was risen. First assessor. Senior counsel for the claimant is instructed in support of the application. The chamber's quiet got a new floor under it. Even the inserted junior went still. Counsel declines the instruction. The application's facts are true and its law is sound, and the board should dismiss it without retiring, because it asks this board to rule that the quality of an advocate is a thing that can be certified in advance by institutions, and counsel is no longer able to argue that position. She heard her own voice keep its courtroom evenness and was distantly grateful to it. Counsel has spent 9 weeks across the floor from the respondent's advocate. The board has watched him locate, without one summons of his own, every fact in this inquiry that anyone now relies on, including several the claimant's counsel relied on in good faith and has had occasion to regret. If he is a clerk, then the spire has been underestimating clerks for 9 centuries, and counsel, for one beat her eyes, crossed the floor and met the ordinary brown ones, which looked back with no triumph at all, only a kind of patient attention which was infinitely worse. Counsel has been underestimating them for 30 years. The application is the claimant's right. It is also beneath this inquiry, and counsel will not lend her name to it. If the directorate requires the argument made, it has other signatures available. She sat. The board did not retire. The application was dismissed in a single sentence, with costs against the claimant, and the feed scribes went out of the doors like water out of a sprung lock. And that evening the ports of 4 systems read that the Combine's own senior counsel had stood up in the spire and called its attack on the human advocate beneath the inquiry. The directorate's liaison called 5 times. Severine had Pellick log the calls in pencil in a paper ledger he had bought to match his, and answered none of them. There was nothing left to discuss but the hour of severance, and the tower would choose it the way it chose everything, on commercial grounds, and she had a witness to prepare for, because the board on the human's quiet application weeks before had never released Harbor Master Ulf Wren from recall. Wren came back to the chair diminished, his oils thinner, his foghorn furred, a being who had spent 9 weeks watching the inquiry he'd lent his voice to come apart plank by plank and had taken private counsel of his own. Everyone in the spire knew it, about the penalties for false witness before a board. Mercer rose with his ledger and was, if anything, gentler than the first time, which Severine now understood was the most dangerous he ever got. Harbor Master, 9 weeks ago you swore to a sequence. The tug first, by ear and by board. You've heard the evidence since. I'm going to ask you the question I didn't ask the first morning, and I'd ask you to remember, before you answer, that the board has the claims office's visitor ledger for the 3 days you spent there before this inquiry opened. The pencil came to rest. Who wrote your incident summary? Harbor Master? The pause went on so long that Assessor Mott shifted to intervene, and then Ulf Wren, 40 years the master of Charvain Reach, put his ceremonial staff across his knees like a man laying down a load and answered. The claims office of the Tesserine Combine wrote it, he said. I was given it to learn. I was told the raw log was administratively complicated. I was told the strain alarm on the terms windward iron was sensor ghosting, and I chose to be told advocate because the row was gone and the dead were dead, and the Combine holds my office's commission, and an old man wanted to believe the version where the disaster wasn't his harbor's rot. His voice didn't break. It just came all the way down to its keel. I'll say the true sequence now, if the board will have it. I heard nothing through those shutters. No being alive could have. But the board lit for the terms windward iron first, 11 minutes before the ox, and I watched it clear itself, and I have kept that watch long enough to know that loads in a building surge do not ease. I knew what a self-clearing strain alarm on a windward iron meant. I had reported that iron singing up the wharfinger's chain myself, twice, with the row walker's logs attached. I knew the way you know a hull is gone before your instruments agree that the term was already walking. He looked at the gallery, at the morning chords, for the first time. And 4 minutes later, Hala sounded the row clear from the windward stand, and saved 4 crews, and I sat in my dry loft and let a tower's clerks teach me to call him the superstitious cast that died near the boat that started it. Even the stone that drank sound could not entirely drink what crossed the chamber then. First Assessor Olek let it pass through, unhurried, the way the old let weather pass, and into the silence after it she said only, "The witness's correction is received. The board will hear the claimant's dock superintendent at next sitting, and the board expects." The copper eyes found the claimant's table and stayed on it. That its registrar's search for the duplicate of folio 88 will conclude before that sitting, one way or the other. The registrar's search concluded the evening before the sitting, and it concluded the way the tower had promised Severine it would. The certificate of diligent search arrived at her chambers for counsel's review as a courtesy, already signed. The duplicate minute misshelved at some unknowable past date, 400 folios hand-checked, the duplicate not found. The registry's procedures regrettably mortal. It was like everything the tower made, immaculate. She read it twice, laid it on the desk beside her enrollment oath which had not gone back into its case in 9 days, and sat for a long time with her hands flat on both. "There is a moment in every channel," the old pilot said on the reach, "when the water under you stops being depth and starts being bottom, when the question is no longer whether you will touch but how you choose to take the ground." She had heard the saying all her life and understood it. Finally, at that desk, with a false certificate under one hand and an oath under the other, 11 lines, the record 4 times, the client none. She did not sleep. She drafted. It was the shortest document of her career and the only one she ever wrote out by hand, in pencil, both copies. The chamber on the morning of the dock superintendent's deposition was the fullest it had been since the inquiry opened. The registrar's certificate was read into the record at the sitting start, and Severine watched the human listen to it with his head slightly tilted, the way he had listened to the harbor master's ears, and watched him decline to rise, decline to object, decline to spend a single word on it, and understood, with the strange new fluency she had developed in his silences, exactly what the silence meant. He could not break the certificate. The plumbing trick had no purchase here. A hand search of a closed registry left no public water lines to measure. The folio's shadow, the foundry schedule, the deferral citation, the selective flood, was strong enough to convict the combine of hiding something. But the sleeve, the row walker's 11 warnings forwarded to the tower and stamped assessed, no action. The thing that turned negligence into knowledge, that lived in 4 pages the board would now never see. He had carried the inquiry to the one door he could not open with arithmetic, and the door was hers. Superintendent Vorogress took the chair at second bell. He was the directorate's creature to the soles of his feet, a heavy, smooth-skinned official of the dockyard's administrative caste who had survived 4 tower purges by the simple expedient of never once writing down anything true, and his evidence-in-chief, conducted by the inserted junior, was a fortress of regretful generality. Maintenance prioritized by integrated risk assessment, resources allocated across the whole estate, the row walker's reports received and weighed within the system. Hindsight, a cruel and unscientific instrument. Severine sat through it at the claimant's table with her 2 pencil copies in her case and took no note at all. Mercer rose, and for the first hour did what the chamber had come to call his soundings. Short questions, dull as lead, each one closing a door behind the witness. Who chaired the integrated risk assessment for berth row 3? The superintendent's office. Who received the wharfinger's consolidated report of the row walker's warnings? The superintendent's office. Who stamped it? The superintendent could not recall the individual stamp. Who held authority to order recasting of a cradle set? Not the superintendent, the directorate, on the superintendent's recommendation. And had the superintendent recommended it? All recommendations of my office, Gress said, were made within the integrated framework. That's not an answer, Superintendent, it's upholstery. Did your office recommend the recasting of berth row 3's cradle set, yes or no? I am not able, at this remove. The Foundry's advanced schedule carries a drafted requisition for that recasting, citing your office as originator. Your office drafted the requisition. Someone above your office stopped it. I'm asking you to tell the board what you recommended and who overruled you, and I remind you that you are sworn on the tide tables, and that the penalty for false witness in a capital inquiry is not administrative. The flat voice did not rise even now. It simply removed, one by one, every surface in the chamber a lie could rest on. Who overruled the requisition, Superintendent? And Severine watched Vorogress, survivor of 4 purges, glance once, a half second, A flick of the eyes the feed scribes missed, but the transcript of her memory kept forever, at the claimant's table, at her, at counsel, for the signal that the fortress would hold. Watched him take the silence of the table for the old assurance. Watched him settle his heavy hands and say, in a voice of perfect administrative sorrow, "No requisition for the recasting of Birth Row 3 was ever stopped, advocate." None reached the directorate. The foundry's notation is a clerical artifact. There was no deferral. The chamber held its 900-year quiet. Mercer stood entirely still, the pencil motionless above the ledger. Out of doors at last, Severine understood. The arithmetic spent. Nothing left in the cardboard folio that could call a sworn lie by its name. First Assessor Oluk's copper eyes had begun to turn, with the slow weight of a tide, toward the claimant's table, toward the question the board did not yet ask. Severine Othick rose before it could be asked. It was important, she had decided in the night, to rise unasked. The difference would matter to no statute and to every soul in the chamber, and she had become, late and at ruinous expense, a student of differences like that. First Assessor. Before the witness's last answer is received, counsel for the claimant asked the board's leave to discharge a duty. Her voice went out into the stone quiet and did not shake. The copying pool girl held the line steady. Counsel is an officer of this board before she is anyone's retained instrument. The board reminded counsel of this. Counsel has needed the reminder. She opened the case and took out the 2 pencil copies. 11 days ago in the directorate's tower, counsel was shown folio 88 of the claimant's minute book, intact, unflooded, in the director's own keeping. Counsel read it. It records the deferral of the recasting of Birth Row 3's cradle set in 2 successive years, on commercial grounds, against the written caution of the claimant's own engineers, upon recommendation originated by the witness's office. Its correspondence sleeve contains the Wharfinger's consolidated report of the Rowwalker Hala's 11 warnings, forwarded to the directorate 8 months before the paired tide, returned stamped assessed, no action. The witness's last answer is false. The registrar's certificate of search is false. The flood is false. Counsel knows these things of her own knowledge and may not, by her oath, sit silent in this chamber while the record is made false around her. She laid 1 pencil copy on the board's table, and the other, crossing the floor on her own feet, in the sight of the gallery, the 11 steps her whole life had narrowed to, on the cardboard folio of the respondent's advocate. This is counsel's sworn memorandum of the folio's contents, made the night she read it, in anticipation of this duty. Counsel hereby withdraws from the claimant's instructions, tenders herself to the board for examination on the memorandum's every line, and accepts what follows. The board will forgive counsel for the lateness of the discharge. She remained standing because there was nowhere left to sit that she had not just set fire to. It is the only part counsel cannot mend. What followed entered the annals of the spire under the registrar's dry style. In Re the Casualty of Birth Row 3, proceedings of the 71st sitting, and was described less dryly by every feed lattice in 4 systems before the tide turned. The director's privilege claims raised by the inserted junior in a voice that had lost its floor and struck down from the bench in 14 words. The board's warrant, issued before the sitting rose, for the folio in the director's keeping, executed by the spire's own wardens at the tower's door at dusk, the first warrant served on a directorate in the Combine's history. The folio itself produced intact because the tower had not dared, in the end, to burn what its counsel had sworn to having read, delivered to the board in its slate covers and read aloud, every line, sleeve and all, by First Assessor Taven Oluk in a chamber where no one moved, the 11 warnings of a dead row walker entering the record at last in the order he had logged them. In the plain harbor grammar, the merfolk used for weather and load, number 2 irons singing wrong on the flood tide, reported. Number 2 and number 4 now both singing, reported again. And the human advocate who had carried the case to the one door he could not open, sat through all of it beside his paper ledger with his hands folded, and when the inserted junior, grasping, demanded the board note that opposing counsel's theatrical defection proved collusion between the parties' advocates, Dale Mercer rose for 6 seconds to make the only personal statement of his 9 weeks. I've spoken to counsel Othick exactly 4 times, all on the record. I'd have been honored otherwise, but she doesn't collude. She reads, there's a difference, and the board's just heard it. He sat down. Across the floor, through the wreckage of her career, with both hearts beating in time for the first time in 11 days, Severine Othick inclined her head 1 degree, advocate to advocate, and the gesture too entered the record, because the feed scribes had long since stopped missing anything either of them did. The Combine fell the way towers fall, which is to say from the inside, and with great attention to the order of the furniture. Within a day of the folio's reading, the directorate announced with sorrow the retirement of Director Hax Tesserin Oval for reasons of health. Within 3, the spire's procurator fiscal had declined to let him retire anywhere, and the wardens who had served the warrant at the tower's door went back up with a second one bearing his name, and a third for Superintendent Vorogress, whose answer under oath had aged in 70 hours from administrative sorrow into a charge of false witness in a capital inquiry. Inspector Cathelmere surrendered his warrant card at the registry counter himself, queuing, the clerks reported, behind 2 apprentices and a fish broker, which the harbor found obscurely satisfying. The claimant's litigation office wrote to the board seeking leave to withdraw the claim against the Salkin Mutual Towage Guild in its entirety, with prejudice, each party to bear its own costs. The human advocate's response to the withdrawal application was 9 words long and was quoted on every lattice in the sector by nightfall. The respondent does not consent. The respondent wants findings. Severine, reading it in the small bare room she had taken above the registry, the chambers had reverted to the Combine's lease within a week, as promised. The tower's machinery for ruining her had continued running smoothly for some days after its head was struck off, like any well-built machine, laughed aloud for the first time in a season. Of course, he did not consent. Withdrawal was the settlement trap again, wearing humbler clothes. No findings, no record. The question of who killed the Rose 17 left politely open for money to fog over in a year or 2. He had refused $4 million for his client's silence, when refusing might have destroyed them. He was not going to accept the same instrument for free now that it couldn't. The guild had hired the cheapest answer in 4 systems, and the cheapest answer was going to make the galaxy's richest combine stand in a stone room and hear a board say out loud what it had done. Her own reckoning came first, because the Spire Bar moved faster against its own than against anyone, and because the bar's conclave of discipline contained, as she had warned Pellic on his first day in her chambers, several beings who had been waiting decades for Severine Othek to supply them with a charge. The citation listed 3, breach of client confidence, in that counsel had disclosed the contents of a privileged communication, namely the folio shown her in the tower, breach of retainer, in that counsel had withdrawn mid-proceeding without leave of her instructing client, and conduct unbecoming in that counsel had. The third charge was the honest one, made the bar look bad by association for 30 years, and then made it look worse by stopping. She appeared before the conclave without counsel, which the lattices called either arrogance or penance, and was neither. It was simply that the only advocate on Vaughn she would have trusted with the brief was occupied, and she knew what the defense was, because she had spent 11 nights getting it by heart before she ever crossed the chamber floor with the pencil copies. Privilege is the client's shield, she told the conclave, standing where she had sent so many others to stand. It is forfeited where the communication is itself the instrument of a fraud upon the board. The folio was shown her not for advice but for recruitment, to procure her craftsmanship in keeping sworn falsehood standing. An advocate's oath runs to the record before it runs to any retainer. Hers ran 11 lines. She recited them from memory and invited the conclave to identify which lines she had broken by telling a board of inquiry the truth. It took them 6 hours, which those learned in the conclave's politics said afterward was the speed of light. 2 charges dismissed. On the third, the withdrawal without leave, a formal rebuke, entered on her roll record, the lightest instrument the conclave possessed. And the presiding elder, an ancient Drathani who had opposed her admission to the high boards 40 years prior on grounds of insufficient deference, added to the rebuke, in a voice like dry paper, 11 words of obiter that the registrar dutifully recorded and the whole bar understood to cancel it. The conclave observes that counsel's oath appears to have survived her career. She walked out of the conclave chamber with her roll intact and her chambers gone 61 years old as the Drathani counted it, rebuked, solvent for perhaps 2 seasons and unemployable by anything on Vaughn with a tower, and found, sitting on the registry's public bench outside the chamber door with a paper ledger on his knees, the cheapest answer in 4 systems, waiting. They keep a good bench out here, Mercer said. I've been hearing about it for 9 weeks. Thought I'd read on it an hour in case you came out wanting company. If you came out wanting quiet, I brought that too. She sat. Below the bench's window, the reach lay at half-tide, gray and working, the cranes of the surviving berth swinging loads against the cloud floor. For a while, neither of them said anything, and she discovered that his quiet was indeed a thing he carried and could share, like the coffee, like the pencil. You knew, she said eventually, the morning you applied for the folio. You built the application knowing the search would be falsified, knowing the shadow alone couldn't convict them of knowledge, knowing the only copy you could ever reach was the one they'd be foolish enough to show their own counsel when they ordered her to bury it. She watched the cranes. You weren't applying for the folio at all. You were applying to me. That's a more elegant version than mine, Mercer said. I just kept noticing you were reading things. People who've stopped reading don't grayfoil a signal log. He turned a page of the ledger, comfortable. In freight claims, when a carrier's gone crooked, there's nearly always one clerk in the office who's kept the true tally out of habit because they can't not. The whole trade is finding that clerk and not frightening them. I didn't find you, counsel. I just tried not to frighten you while you found yourself. The bar will say you practiced upon opposing counsel. The bar said worse about me this season. He let the dry beat sit, then closed the ledger. The findings sitting is in 11 days. The boards asked the parties for written addresses on the death prices. The guilds instructed me that the row walker's widow speaks before anyone else and longer than everyone else, which between us was their advocate's idea, and the advocate needs a favor he can't ask anyone with a tower. He looked at her ordinary brown eyes, no triumph in them, 9 weeks, and not one flicker of triumph anywhere in him, which she had finally stopped finding insulting and started finding restful. 17 death prices under the old harbor code against a combine and receivership proceedings, with priority disputes against the hull insurers and the cargo pools. It's ledger work, doctrine work, the kind a freight clerk gets wrong by 1 mark, twice. The families deserve counsel of proven standing. He said it without smiling. Her own application's language, offered back to her not as a hook but as a hand. I can pay junior rates. The pools are mutual. We're famously cheap. Severine Othick, lately of the Spire's high boards, formally rebuked, sat on a public bench with the wind off the mudflats in her face, and was silent for the length of 1 full crane swing, taking with great care the most expensive brief of her life. Counsel for the families, she said, will want every receipt the casualty office has issued in 5 years. Going back further if the priority point requires it. All of it. The originals. There she is, said the human, and that was the entire celebration. He was already opening the ledger to the page where the work began. The 11 days before the findings sitting were the strangest working days of her life, and the best, and she did not need the perspective of years to know it. She knew it each morning, climbing the chandlery's outside stair with the tide damp on the rail to the small room where the case lived in cardboard and string. The room had 1 table. They worked at opposite ends of it. Counsel for the families and advocate for the guild, allied parties with separate briefs, and the discipline of the table never slackened. Positions exchanged in writing, conflicts flagged aloud, the record of their cooperation kept as scrupulously as the record of everything else, because, Mercer said it once, mildly, when Pellick proposed a shortcut, we're about to ask a board to believe paper again. Ours had better be the kind that can be believed. Pellick had arrived on the 2nd morning, carrying his resignation from the combine lease chambers in one hand and his chandlery pencil in the other, and had been assigned the death price doctrine of the old harbor code, 900 years of it, which he took to the registry's public room and read in the queue, like anyone. The guildmother came each evening with supper for whoever was still working, having appointed herself to that watch with the same authority she ran her guild by, and stood over the human until he ate. The widow Imthala came twice by invitation, and was read every word that would be said on her behalf, and changed some of them, and her changes were better. Severine, who had commanded 40 staff and a wall of light, built the family's brief with a junior, a pencil, and a borrowed table, and found the work had a taste she had forgotten, the taste of the copying pool, of law done by hand at the speed of understanding. She drafted the priority argument against the hull insurers 3 times before it sang. She footnoted the receivership point so hard the Procurator Fiscal's office wrote asking for a copy. And on the 8th evening, hunting a death price precedent through the code's oldest stratum, she found the line the whole address would close on. Set down by some assessor of the reach 9 centuries dead, the price of a death on the water is not the worth of the one who died, which is beyond the harbor's purse, but the cost of the truth of how, which the harbor can always afford, and can never afford to waive. There's your spine, Mercer said, when she read it across the table. He didn't look up from his own page, but the pencil paused above one ear. They'll be quoting that one again in another 900 years. On the 9th evening, the guildmother stayed after the supper baskets were cleared, and sat down across the one table from Severine in the chair the human had vacated for the registry's late counter, and the 2 of them, counsel for the families and the head of the vindicated guild, the 2 beings in Charvain reach who had mocked him first and to his face, regarded each other over the cardboard and string with the frankness, available only to the equally guilty. I called him a clerk in his hearing, Akabren said, without preamble, because the Mer and the Olvar alike held that important accounts were settled plainly or not at all. You called him the cheapest answer in 4 systems. Your junior told my secretary, harbors keep nothing. I have been wanting to ask someone who would understand, and the someone is you, counsel, which the tide must find as funny as I do. How did we both look straight at him and see nothing? Severine set down her pencil. She had drafted answers to gentler questions for 30 years. This one she answered with the only draft she had. Because he carried nothing we had been taught to price, she said. No retinue, no gown, no wall of light. We mistook the absence of decoration for the absence of weight. It is the oldest error in the ledger, Guildmother, and the towers are built on our making it. They decorate everything, precisely, so that beings like you and me will keep mistaking polish for soundness. Your irons were stamped. My evidence was bound in slate blue. His folio was cardboard. She heard the next sentence arrive and let it. It had been 9 months coming. The mockery was never about him at all. It was the sound of two beings reassuring themselves that the prices they had paid for their own standing were still the market. The Guildmother considered that the way she considered a splice, turning it, testing the lay of it. When my hall corrected its minute, she said at last, he asked us to initial his expenses. I have thought about it every tide since. A being who had waited his whole life to be apologized to would have stood there and breathed it in. He went to the arithmetic. Her 4 hands flattened on the table. It was not humility, counsel. I have seen humility. It performs. This was something my trade has a word for, and yours may not. When a line holds a load all day, it does not want praising at the end of the shift. It wants inspecting and coiling dry and using again tomorrow. He is line, not pennant. The whole of him is for bearing, none of him is for flying. And we two stood on the quay of our own harbor laughing because he didn't flutter. And now every pennant in the reach dips him, Severine said. Twice, the Guildmother agreed with the ghost of the hall's tar-dry humor and stood and gathered the baskets and paused at the door with the rain starting soft on the stair. Finish the family's brief well, counsel. Not for the dead. The dead are past briefs. For the next gray little being who walks into some bright chamber, somewhere carrying everything that matters in a paper folio. Make the records say what they're worth before the laughing starts. It saves so much time. The findings sitting of the Board of Inquiry into the casualty of Berth Row 3 convened on a morning of high bright water, both moons down, the reach below the spire's windows crowded with every working hull in the port, standing off its berths, with cranes raised, the harbor's oldest. Salute last given, the registrar's office confirmed 60 years before. The chamber doors were opened at dawn and the gallery was full by half-tide. Morning cords in the front rows and the wardens, on the board's instruction, kept 17 seats empty among them with a white cord across each. The widow spoke first and longest as instructed. She spoke in the most ceremonial cadence, 4 hands folded, of the row-walker's trade. What it was to walk iron in weather for a wage the towers called generous. To know each bollard's voice the way a herder knows a beast. To report and report and report into a system that stamped and never sent anyone down to listen. She did not accuse, she inventoried. It took her 1 hour, and when she finished, he sounded the row clear sirs with the spine already going under him. He was not superstitious. He was the only part of that row's maintenance that was never deferred. The chamber's stone drank the silence and gave back, faintly, from the water below, the sound of the standing fleet's horns, because the dockside lattices had carried her voice down to the reach, and the reach had answered. First Assessor Ty Van Oluk read the findings in the old form, standing, the folio and the pocketbook gap and the 11 warnings, all of it now woven into a single plain narrative of cause. That the tide irons of the Gilded Terms cradle failed of fatigue knowingly left unrepaired. That the deferral was made on commercial grounds against engineering caution and renewed after warning. That the warnings of the row-walker Halla were received, recorded, and disregarded at directorate level. That the inspection certificates were false, the incident summary procured, the evidence smelted, the folio concealed, the flood invented, the search certified falsely. That the tug Patient Ox and the Salkin Mutual Towage Guild bore no causal responsibility whatsoever, the tug's moorings having parted as the manual's own doctrine predicted, under loads no small craft's lines were ever rated to carry, and that the row clear sounded by the row walker from the windward stand had saved not fewer than 31 lives, for which the board, on behalf of the Reach, recorded the harbor's debt. The levy fell where the findings pointed. Full casualty liability upon the Tessering Combine in receivership, the family's claims to rank ahead of every hull and cargo interest, Severine's priority argument adopted from the bench in its entirety, footnotes and all. 17 death prices at the code's highest measure, and an 18th instrument unprecedented, drafted on the board's own motion. A standing trust for the maintenance of Berth Row 3's rebuilt irons, funded from the Combine's forfeitures, to be administered. The chamber turned as one creature, by the Salkin Mutual Towage Guild, the only institution before this inquiry, the old assessor said, laying down the page, whose paper never once required correction. Cost followed, savage and itemized. References followed: the director, the superintendent, the inspector, the registrar, to the procurator fiscal. The harbor master alone accepted from referral in consideration of a correction made in open chamber at personal cost. Wren wept. The lattices reported, and made no effort to hide it. And then the findings read in the board not yet risen. Tiven Oluk did the thing for which the sitting is remembered on two worlds, and looked down at the respondent's table, at the gray man sitting beside his paper ledger with his hands folded. Advocate Mercer. 9 weeks ago, this board asked whether it should be satisfied that you were adequate to the weight of this matter, and you answered that the board should be satisfied by the record. The board has now read the record. The copper eyes held him. The board finds the record satisfactory. Thank you, first assessor, Mercer said, and stood, and the gallery waited for whatever a being says at the summit of such a season, and he said, the respondent asks one correction to the order as read. The trust instrument names the guild's advocate among its supervising signatories. The respondent asks that the line be amended to name the widow Hala in his place. The advocate's part in this matter ends today, and the irons will be singing long after he's gone home. The watch should belong to the harbor. The order is amended, Oluk said, and if 900 years of Spirestone had a way of approving of anyone, the chamber's silence was it. The guild took their advocate to the guild hall that night whether he consented or not, four-armed beings being difficult to refuse on questions of hospitality. And what happened there was reported to Severine the next morning by Pellick, who had been invited as the family's junior counsel, and had observed everything with the verbatim habit she had ruined him with forever. The hall had been hung with the funeral grays still, because the guild did not celebrate while death prices remained unpaid. Instead of celebration there had been supper, the long tables filled with towage families and salvage wardens and merfolk from the row, and at the supper's end, Guildmother Otkabren had stood, with the whole hall standing after her, and done the thing her line had done for important debts for 7 decades. She had read out, from the guild's own minute book, in the old harbor spelling, the entry of the first morning, that the guild had met its advocate and judged him a clerk, and said so in his hearing, and that the entry was wrong, and that the guild's custom was not to strike wrong entries but to correct them on the facing page so that the wrongness would be remembered along with its correction. And on the facing page, dated, witnessed, sealed with the guild's tar and wax seal, she had entered the correction. This hall records that Advocate Dale Mercer, of the associate role, is no clerk, except in the oldest sense which the harbor had forgotten and he reminded us of, one who keeps the account true. The guild's gates stand open to him and his line while one plank of this hall floats. And he said, Severine asked, although 9 weeks had taught her almost exactly what he would have said. He thanked them, Pellick said, and asked whether, since the minute book was out anyway and everyone was assembled, the guild would mind initialing his fee reconciliation, because the pool's auditors are strict and he was leaving on the month-end packet. Pellick's inner lids flickered, the Drathani tell for emotion contained at cost. They initialed it, counsel. It came to less than my quarter's stipend used to. The guild mother tried to triple it, and he declined the difference and told her the trust fund could hold it. And she called him 4 names in Harbor Olvar that the lattice refused to translate, and he wrote them down phonetically and asked what they meant, and she wouldn't tell him, and counsel they were endearments. The whole table knew. He may even have known. He just put the ledger away and let her win the exchange the way he, Pellick, stopped and looked for the words, and gave up and used the simple ones. The way he always lets the other party keep their dignity, even when it costs him his own coin. Especially then, Severine said. Write it down, Pellick, not for the file, for yourself. The death prices were paid before the month end, the priority ranking holding against 2 appeals that collapsed of their own embarrassment, and Severine and Pellick carried the instruments down to the Rose families door by door, on their own feet, because the casualty office whose stamps had processed the dead was not going to be the harbor's last word to them. Counsel was. At the widow Hala's door, the widow took the instrument in 2 of her 4 hands, read it through entire, folded it once and said, he would have asked what the priority argument was. He liked to know how a thing held. So Severine stood on a Murd doorstep in the tide damp and explained, to a rowwalker's widow, 900 years of maritime priority doctrine and how the families had been moved to the head of it. And the widow listened all the way through, nodding at the joints of the argument as though testing welds. And when it was done, she said, it holds. And that was the only review of her advocacy in 30 years that Severine Othick ever framed. The rebuilt row was renamed by the harbor before any office could vote on it. Painted boards went up on the first reconstructed berth overnight, unsigned in the MERS plain lettering, and the registry, bowing to what it could not catch, amended its charts the following season. Hala's Row. The trust's first act was to commission the recasting the tower had deferred, and the foundry of the southern yards, unprompted, poured the first iron with a tithe of metal from the smelted wreckage the combine had tried to disappear, so that the foundry master's letter to the trust said the row would carry its own memory in its bones. The patient ox went back to her berth re-rigged, her new lines bought by subscription among the salvage wardens, and tugmasters coming up channel learned to dip their pennants twice passing the windward stand. Once for the row walker, once the harbor's joke ran. For the pencil. Harbor Master Ulf Wren served out his final season and retired on the anniversary of the paired tide, and on his last day he walked down to the chandlery, in the plain coat of a private citizen, carrying the brass tide glass that had stood in the watch loft window for 40 years, and left it with the counterkeeper, wrapped, addressed in his own hand, for the advocate D. Mercer, who heard what I only watched. From an old man who chose to be told this instrument which never once lied to me. It caught the month-end packet as freight, and the freight manifest, Severin checked, months later, missing them both. Recorded its declared value as beyond assessment, which the clerks of the Reach had decided among themselves was now a recognized customs category, there being precedent. The combine survived, after its fashion, as a smaller and quieter thing run by its engineering castes, who voted in their first general minute to print the row walkers' 11 warnings inside the cover of every maintenance ledger the company issued. Above a single line of instruction, assess means go down and listen. Severine read that minute in the public registry. She read everything in the public registry now. The habit had become the practice, and the practice had become the firm, and noted with an old advocate's cold satisfaction that the directorate's slate blue binding had been retired company-wide. Paper that color, the new registrar of the combine was reported to have said, has a history in this port of being too clean. Her own brass plate went up on the chandlery's stair rail the week the death prices cleared, because the room above the chandlers stood empty after the month-end packet sailed, and the rent suited a rebuked advocate with 2 seasons solvency, and because she gave Pellick no other reason, and he asked for none, some rooms should stay in the trade. Othick and Avo, the plate read, advocates, paper read. The harbor understood the third line as the firm's entire prospectus, which it was, and brought up its disputes and its singing irons and its impossible certificates by the armload, and paid in what it had, and the firm of Othick and Avo was solvent by the next paired tide cycle's first season and famous on the Reach by its second, not for winning, which the harbor expected of advocates, but for the thing the harbor had stopped expecting until a human taught it to expect it again, for being the office where the account was kept true. She saw him off at the month-end packet, the only farewell he had agreed to, having declined the guild's flotilla escort, the board registrar's formal honors, and the feed lattice's valedictory panel with the same flat courtesy. He came down the chandlery stair with one case in the cardboard folio, now empty and string-tied, which he was keeping, he said, because it was a good folio and the pool's auditors were strict. The packet rode at the quay in a thin morning rain. The salvage wardens had found reasons to be working near the gangway, all of them. The counterkeeper had found a reason to bring down a flask of human coffee for the crossing. The guildmother had found no reason at all and stood openly on the quay in her work harness, forearms folded, daring anyone to remark on it. Counsel, Mercer said. Advocate, I've left the silt tea in the room. It grows on you, but not so far that I'd carry it home. He looked out at the Reach, at the cranes of Hollow's Row swinging against the gray, at the patient ox sitting fat and re-rigged at her berth, and Severine watched him do the thing she had finally learned to see on the first morning of the harbor master's deposition. The slow, unhurried read of a thing entire, start to finish, skipping nothing, the way other beings read pages. It's a sound harbor, he said at last, which she understood by then was the longest sentence of praise in his entire vocabulary, and was about the people. I have a question, she said. I've held it 9 months. The first morning, before the board, when Mott asked if you were adequate to the weight of the matter, every advocate alive would have argued. You just pointed at the record that didn't exist yet, as though you knew what it would say. The rain moved over the quay, fine as sieved flour. I've built the cross-examination 40 ways since, and I still can't make you answer it. So as one counsel to another, between us and the tide, how did you know? The human considered the question with the same attention he'd given the sheared irons, and answered it, as he answered everything, like a man initialing a reconciliation. I didn't know what the record would say, he said. I knew somebody would have written the truth down somewhere. Somebody always has. A row walker, a foundry clerk, a tide warden, a girl in a copying pool. The truth of a harbor is never missing, counsel. It's just filed where nobody important looks. The whole of my trade, he picked up the case in the folio and inclined his head toward her exactly 1 degree, advocate to advocate, returning the chamber's gesture at the distance of 9 months as being nobody important and looking. He went up the gangway in the rain. The packet swung out past the windward stand at the turn of the tide and dipped her pennant twice and was gone down channel by the time the rain lifted. The last entry in this account belongs to the spire, as last entries on Vaughan generally do. At the next session of the bar's full conclave, there was laid before the high boards a motion, unprecedented in form, to inscribe upon the permanent roll of the spire bar, the 900-year roll, the roll of full advocates, the roll that no associate and no off-worlder had ever touched, the name of an advocate in absentia in recognition of service to the record itself. The motion was opposed by 2 elders on grounds of form, there being no precedent, and the sponsoring council, rising, agreed that there was no precedent and informed the conclave that she had checked, because checking was now her practice, and that she had brought the original registries to prove the absence, all of them, on a trolley, and the conclave, eyeing the trolley, the harbinger said later, passed the motion rather than be read to. She inscribed the name herself, by the registrar's leave, at the foot of the great roll in the registry's silent vault, in the careful hand of a copying pool girl, with a pencil first and then in permanent ink over it, the way entries of record had been made in the registry when she was young, drafted humbly, then confirmed. Dale Mercer, it reads, advocate of the spire bar. He read everything. The lattices, when they reported it, called the line beneath the name an epitaph in advance and a galaxy-class compliment, and several other things the feed scribes are paid to call things. The registry's clerks, who had queued beside the man at the public counter and knew exactly what the line was, entered it in the catalog under its proper heading, and the catalog does not exaggerate. The heading says, Standard of Practice. And on the far side of 4 systems, in the cramped offices of the Hollow Star Mutual Indemnity Pool, where the rates are the cheapest going and the auditors are strict, a gray man at a paper ledger received in the same month's post a brass tide glass, a tar-sealed page of Harbor Olvar endearments he never did get translated, and a notice of enrollment from the Spire Bar of Charvain Reach, with Counsel S. Othic's card folded inside it. He hung the tide glass in the window where it caught the morning light. He filed the sealed page under correspondence kept. And the enrollment notice he read twice, the way he read everything important, and then he took out his pencil and wrote the pool's reply in the margin for the office junior to copy fair, 11 words, which the junior, being strictly trained, copied exactly, received and noted. Fee schedule unchanged. We remain available for small claims.